We we are now live. I want to thank everybody for joining us on another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and I'd like to thank my colleague and guest, esteemed guest, I should say, for joining us live from Canada, Professor Salim Mansur. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing very well, sir. I'm very happy to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, sir. Let's get right into it. We we see the global scene. Um, seems like it is just chaotic right now. When we look at Donald Trump and his administration, it shows the hallmark signs of a collapsing republic as well as a dying empire. Um, I see where they kidnapped a sitting head of state and refuses to return him back home. We see that they are now saying that they're turning the Western Hemisphere into America's backyard, and nobody has the right to come to America's backyard. But America has no problem in going into West Asia, Africa, and Eurasia, and all of this stuff. With that said, and they threatened Canada also when Canada said that they may not buy the F-35s. Trump said that, hey, we'll fly F-35s in Canadian airspace if we want to. What is going on, and do we see a rogue nation, rogue empire now on steroids and unhinged?
Yes, brother. The world is unhinged. It is unhinged because of America. Let's me be frank. I want to say to you, brother, and to your audience that I'm not an American, but I sit north of the 49 parallel. We are kissing cousin, you might say. um, so my view in this sense is not a view of an American, but of somebody from outside of America, non-American, who has watched, observed, studied America for more than 50 years, and have had tremendous respect and affection for America. But in these 50 years, I have seen profound changes. And in this last period, um, we might date it from the coming of Donald Trump in the first iteration, 2015. Uh, whatever the expectation was at that time for many people, what we see now is America is unhinged because the leadership in America have basically thrown away, discarded the guardrails of American society, American Republic, that's the Constitution. America has become dysfunctional because America is no longer on the rails of the American Constitution. In a very short take of mine, and we can elaborate and expand on all of these things, is that um, there is nothing I would argue in modern terms. I'm not going back to before 1776, but I'll come to it. Um, nothing that is provided for in the founding document of the American Republic can be remedied, can be secured if America follows the founding documents. That is, if it is run along the lines of the American Constitution. This precedent, more than anyone else in the living memory of any Americans or people from outside America who has been watching America, studying America, um, observing America, this president, President Donald J. Trump, the 47th president, 45th, 47th president, has, by his own mouth, by his own actions, by his own behavior and conduct, said that he is not bound by anyone's rules, anyone's regulation. He took the oath of office on January 2025, the second time, and the oath of office is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, not anybody's religion, not the cross, not the Star of David, not anything else, but it is the Constitution. Constitution is the sacred political document of the American Republic. But this president has said this openly. I mean, all of you, my brother, you have heard him say it to the New York Times investigative reporters and correspondents sitting in the Oval Office with the president when he was asked, what is it that he follows or can be constrained by? And he said openly, only my mind and my morality, you know? So America is sailing in the ocean, so to speak, if we draw the metaphor of a ship, is sailing in the ocean with the captain on the steering wheel trying to navigate it by having thrown away the map, by having thrown away all the precedent, by having thrown away all the mechanism of sailing the ocean that was provided by the founding father. That's the unhinged part of it. And nobody, and I am a Canadian, can figure out what is this president's goal, objective in the remaining terms of this office? Or is he one going to declare himself King George the Fourth and say, we begin all over again. We are back to before 1776. That is my short take on your question, brother.
Do you believe that there will be more wars under Trump? And do you believe that he will try, as you said, try to remain in office, because he's been hinting a lot at a third term in office, and he's been getting a lot of flack about that. So do you believe that he, if war breaks out and things doesn't go the way that he really wants them to go, that he will seize power?
Well, there is going to be more conflict. War is a conflict. There will be more conflict. The irony is that if the conflict that he is pushing for, whether it is taking over Greenland after Venezuela, he has threatened Canada, he's of course at the edge of a war in Iran, with what he called the gathering of the beautiful armada. Nobody told him the history of the Spanish armada that was sailing for England and then got blown away. So this man has no respect for history, no respect for law, no respect for anything. So there is conflict. The irony is that if he cannot pursue the conflict abroad, because the combination of forces that are awakening or have awakened and defend their rights as sovereign independent state, then he is bringing the conflict right back home. I mean, what is the difference between the conflict in Venezuela threatening Greenland, or the second time around in Iran, than the conflict that is raging in the streets of Minneapolis and other cities in America, where he is trying to federalize the National Guards with the threat of calling in the Insurrection Act? He's already displayed, that is, his people has displayed, that it is going to be a matter of force that will be employed, and you know that better than I do as an American, what is happening in your streets with the American version of the Gestapo, that is ICE, immigration and whatever else it is called, custom enforcement agency, and the DHS, that this illegal, unlawful activity of this president, as I began by saying, is no longer checked by the Constitution. So he has broken the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment of the American Constitution. And he's done this, as I look at it and observe it, with the complicity of the majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So what is it happening in America that one man can do all of that, and 535 elected representatives of the people simply roll their thumb and watch him doing it, without, you know, enforcing the requirements of the Constitution, challenging him, and bringing him to books, by the mechanism that is provided in the Constitution. Impeachment, impeaching his officers, the Secretary of DHS, for instance, the FBI director, and so on and so forth. So he has successfully, this is the irony, successfully deconstructed and made impotent the American Constitution.
Hmm. You know, maybe the reason that the congressmen and the senators all capitulated to Trump is because they all serve the same behind the scene powers that fund their campaigns to get into office. And maybe there's a bigger plan behind this, because if we look at what is going on with the United States, and we see the bubbling effect of dissatisfaction with the population rising up, and the Gestapo trying to suppress this. And then if we look at it, mirrors America's foreign policy, and those are signs of a collapsing empire and a desperate power structure. Because if you look at America's debt, her proclaimed debt is 38, $39 trillion, when everybody knows it's in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. And then we see that nations are now moving outside of the dollar. And I believe these are desperate acts by to have a stopgap from the collapse of the US dollar, the collapse of American hegemony. And they will do anything to try to prevent any, because it's in the stated policy, anything to prevent any nation or combination of nations to rise to near peer or peer power to challenge America. So in my mind, I'm looking at this from the perspective of, we're watching the fall of America, and these people who are in power, they're doing their best to buy empire just a little more time.
Yes, I mean, America is a republic that got transformed into an empire, and what you say is all true. But given my own study and background as a historian, as a political economist, this did not happen overnight.
No, it did not.
There was a process that was going on,
Mhm.
and it is the collective weight of the American representatives in the House and the Senate, and then on the states, the 50 states of America. Technically, the states have power,
Mhm.
again, based on the Constitution. So this imperial presidency that Donald Trump now symbolizes, in effectively, not only metaphorically, um, has a long history behind it, at least in the modern period, going back to the end of World War II, so the last 80 years. But if you go even further back, brother, the Spanish American Wars, 1898, that led to the Republic taking over Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
Cuba, and then moving on to Philippines and Hawaii. Uh, this was not in the construct of the American Republic, founded in 1776. So, what I'm pointing out, there was a process by which America started going beyond its boundaries and assuming land, territory, resources beyond the continental boundaries of American Republic, to the point that after Second World War, America emerged with an economy, a GDP, that was more than 50% of the global GDP. So if you want to put it in historical context, yes, it was the American people went along with it, or at least the majority of people went along with it, instead of saying, we are a republic, we are a constitutional republic. You cannot do anything, Mr. President. You cannot do anything, Mr. Senator. You cannot do anything, Mr. Congressman, Miss Congresswoman, without our permission. You
Mhm.
know, American people did not stand up for that. They did during the Vietnam War, and therefore the Vietnam War was brought to an end. Your people, Brother Rashid, paid a heavy price in that war, more
Hmm.
than a heavy price, because people, that is not the colored people, not Black Americans, but the majority population, with money and access, got themselves deferred. You know, they
Hmm.
went to graduate school instead of, you know, going in the draft to do their duty as a citizen. The Bill Clintons of this world. Of course, this president, excused himself. He wants to be the president, the emperor of the greatest military power in the world. That is his boast. But he himself never served.
Hmm.
He never put on the uniform. He never went anywhere in defense of American interests, or whether it was American interests or not. Vietnam, I would argue, had no American interests, uh, but it was a decision to send American men and women to war in Vietnam, and by the law, people had to report for the draft. Donald Trump didn't. He used this, what was it, bone spur or something of that nature, that got him deferred. So the people did not protest except for those who were directly affected. And as the great Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion, said, the Viet Cong have done nothing to me. Why should I go and fight them? They've done nothing to us. They have not threatened us or anything of that sort. So there was no imminent threat to America. And there was no declaration of war by the Congress, because this is only the Congress has the authority to declare war, to initiate war. It is so clearly written in Section 8 of the Article 1, Section 8 of the American Constitution that only the Congress can declare war, initiate and declare war, not the president. And so America has engaged in going abroad without congressional approval. In other words, without the approval of the American people. So this process is going on. The people have stood aside and allowed this process to go on. Nobody has been held responsible and accountable. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Nobody has been held accountable for those deaths, and why it happened. And so it is like removing a brick from a wall, and nobody protested. And one brick was removed, two brick was removed, and subsequently enough brick was removed from the wall that the wall collapsed. The Constitution collapsed, and it is not functioning. And that's why this president can do whatever he wants. So when a country becomes, in that sense, reduced to functioning in terms of what a man thinks, what is in his mind, what is his morality, then that country is not even an empire. That country is simply another fascist power.
Hmm.
And that is what we have. You have a leader who thinks he's above everybody else. So when a country doesn't have when the leader has no respect for his own history, for his own precedent, for his own founding documents, for his own constitution, and nobody in the government, that is an American government, is made of checks and balances according to the Constitution, that is the Congress and the judiciary, the Supreme Court, which are all of equal power. No one is superior to the other. The president is not superior to the Congress. The Congress is not superior to the president. And neither is the court, the judiciary. They are all equal branches of the government, constructed in a manner that no one person can dominate and dictate how the country will be run. A country as big and huge and complex and multi-ethnic and multi-religious can be run by the wishes of one man or a collection of a group of people, the oligarchs, the moneyed people, or as we have come to know what President Eisenhower warned. He said military industrial complex. We now know it is the deep state.
Hmm.
That there is a deep state that is hidden from the people who is in some way or in many ways running the presidency. And the president is fully obligated to the powers of the deep state, you know.
Mhm.
So when such a thing happens, we are, that is, the American people are in a situation in which the distinction between a citizen and a slave has been completely eradicated. You know, you are owned and possessed without any rights, without any due process, you know,
Mhm.
or what you do, what you say. You're under constant surveillance. Um, and so, what the Constitution provided you to bear arms for your own safety, now you cannot. That has been violated. That you can speak out in protests and gather peacefully in protests, you cannot. That has been violated. You know, your property, your home cannot be entered and searched and you arrested without a proper warrant. That has been violated. So then what are you then as an American citizen? That fundamental distinction between a citizen and a serf, a citizen and a slave, that is, a citizen is a sovereign individual. The Constitution ultimately, particularly the American Constitution, was designed by the founding fathers to protect the individual, the primacy of the individual, the freedom of the individual, that what God has endowed, the Creator has endowed, life, liberty, and happiness, cannot in any way be interfered with, abrogated, abridged by any power. That is what it is all about. And so when that goes, then you are no better than a serf or a slave. And that is what has happened. Because the American people were bought. It was like the 30 shekels that was given to Judas Iscariot to sell Jesus. The American people have been bought. They have been bought with money. They have been bought with seduction. They have been bought with pornography. They have been bought with drugs and addiction. I mean, he goes out to kidnap Nicolas Maduro. We can talk about the unlawful act, that is, in terms of both domestic law, that is the Constitution, and international law, within the UN system. He goes to arrest them because it is about drugs, drugs, drugs. But the drugs are being brought in and being supported by the American government's own department. The Drug Enforcement Agency is the biggest drug dealers in America,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
These are known facts, uh, and yet, so that means drugs have been used to corrupt the American people, to subdue the American people, to break them down. That's exactly what happened to China, for instance,
The
when
opium
the
wars.
British imported or exported, with forcing China to the open door policy to import and sell opium. And opium was transported from the land where I was born, India, East India Company, under the British Empire, into China. The opium trade carried out by that group of people, the Jews. Mr. Sassoon was the biggest opium trader out of Mumbai or Bombay in India under the East India Company. And a lot of American traders, including the family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were involved in that open door policy trade. I mean, that's where the wealth of people came from. And so China was destroyed from inside through drug. It took a revolution, it took warfare for Chinese to rise up and become an independent sovereign country in 1949 under the communists. So communism is bad, and we don't want to, you know, sit down here and praise the communists. But what the communists did was made China strong and sovereign. And under Mao Zedong, drug addiction was completely eliminated. So if the American government wanted the American people to be protected from drug addiction, from alcoholism, and so on, it could do that. It doesn't have to go and kidnap Maduro, because that was a fake argument. So I'm coming back to, this is more than Donald Trump. I wrote a piece the other day quoting the famous statement in the Sermon on the Mount by, I think it is in the Sermon on the Mount, I could be mistaken, by Jesus, where he says, "Take the beam out of your eyes before you look for the
Mhm,
mole in the eyes of others."
mhm,
So, how can the American leadership go around preaching to other people what they are desecrating, violating in their own country,
mhm,
where their own people have been subjugated to uh, modern day serfdom or slavedom?
mhm,
That is the situation, brother. It has become worse and worse and worse. A republic, remember, it is the story of America. When Benjamin Franklin in 1789 came out of that building where they were negotiating and ratifying the American Constitution after it had been drafted in 1789, I believe it was the ratification year. And once that had been done, he came out on the street. According to what I have read, he was accosted, he was caught up by a group of people, and there was a woman who asked him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you all been doing?" And he said, "Well, we have made a republic if you can keep it." So if you can keep it, belongs to the people. The republics belong to the people. I have the Constitution right here in my hand. And the opening preamble is, "We the people of the United States," right? "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, issue domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain this Constitution for the United States of America." This is the people's document, my friend. It is not a document handed down by some emperor, but now you have an emperor who says he will run America just because what his mind tells him to do.
hmm. Yeah, I think, like, especially when concerning the Constitution, I think as we go back to stuff like this, um, it was it was an inevitability for them to go off the Constitution, because when they did the Constitution, it was never meant for black people, women, anybody from outside of the European class. And so and if we go further up to I think, as they started detaching themselves from their so-called principles and morals, we look to 1911 through 1914, when they gave the power to coin, which was in that same Constitution that was in the hands of Congress. They gave it to the private Federal Reserve. And then we saw that they started in July 4th, 1930, they started implementing laws which marked the end of America. We didn't get a chance to understand it until now. As I often give this analysis, that was the snake. They were cutting off the snake's head. All we were living in the snake's contortions, and now rigor mortis is setting in, because if you look from the 1930s, and you go up to the 1960s, they started stealing the silver out of the coins. We go from that up to 71, when it was uh the admiral who became the president of France, de Gaulle, when he started seeing that America's spending spree was like crazy, and de Gaulle and Nixon said the US dollar is as good as gold, and Charles de Gaulle said, well, if that's the case, then give me gold, then give me my gold back. And that caused Nixon to put a halt on the shipping out of gold, which then they had, because they did not have the amount of gold, so they had to reprice gold and find another way to keep the dollar bag, which came the petrodollar. And from that, we move up to the 80s and the 90s when Bill Clinton started to do away with the Glass-Steagall Act and all of these other acts, which weakened the monetary system even more because of the corruption and the greed that they have, which led us up to right where we are today, where we see an unhinged debt burden. We see that when the economic and political shackles was taken off in 1971, we're living in the final days of that, because now nations are saying, hey, all of this is a faith effort in paper. We need something tangible. And I believe this is what is causing the unhinged drive mentally from these lunatics like Trump and everybody else, because they have a vested interest in maintaining empire at the expense of the vast majority of the planet of the world. And when we talk about that, something you said, that they as a republic, they stopped looking at the republic and they started lecturing everybody else. And America goes around the world and talks about liberty and freedom and human rights when she comprises only 5% of the population of the planet Earth, yet she holds 25 to 30% of the prison population. And when we flip it back to the drugs, we know that there was a concerted effort by the CIA and all of these agencies to flood Black and inner city communities with drugs and with guns and stuff to suppress them. And all of this stuff is blowback from the policies that they initiated to try to suppress other people and overthrow other people. So what America is getting right now is the blowback effect of a centuries-long policy of suppression, war, exploitation, and arrogance. What would you say on that matter?
Yeah, you have drawn a long history, and so that, no, it is right. I mean, all the various points that you have touched on is right. In its isolation, if you look at it, 1913, the making of the Federal Reserve, that you talked about. You might at the same time could have mentioned that Woodrow Wilson took America to war in 1917 when he had pledged during the election of 1916 that he would never take America to war in Europe. And yet within 3 months of the election happened in November. In those days, the inauguration would take place in March. And so Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated for his second term in March of 1917. And then in April of 1917, he takes America to war. He goes to the Congress and asks for Congress to declare war because of what happened. And what happened was very likely, if not most likely, a false flag where the American ship Lusitania was torpedoed by the Germans. Lusitania was a passenger ship, but the Americans had loaded up with weapons being sent to England. And so it was not a passenger ship, it was an armed ship, and the Germans attacked it. Just like the sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba in 1898. That was a false flag operation because it's still a matter of dispute who sunk USS Maine, but it gave the pretext to declare war, just as the Lusitania incident gave the pretext to declare war, just as the Pearl Harbor issue, if you get into the details, was a pretext. So all of these are quite correct, you're saying, pointing out, and I'm adding to it, like the Vietnam War with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was a pretext. Saddam Hussein with weapons of mass destruction. It was a pretext. There was no weapons of mass destruction. Maduro with drugs, blowing up those boats in the Caribbean, without due process. I mean, if they were carrying drugs, the Coast Guard could have stopped it, searched it, and brought the people into the court. for indictment, but no, they bombed it. So again, a false flag, because the drugs are going through Colombia and Mexico on the Pacific coast, not through Venezuela on the Caribbean Sea coast.
Hmm.
So, yes, all of these points are there. But what I was pointing out, brother, that it is an evolution.
Hmm.
America was not born as an empire. America was born. I'm talking about 1776. We can shift gear, and I would engage with you by shifting gear about before 1776, because as you pointed out in one of my last conversation with you, the story of the blacks who did not come in after 1776, who came in 1619. I think you pointed out the date, or even before 1619.
1555.
Yeah. Okay. So we can go back, and we can go back all the way to Columbus and the Plymouth, and the genocide that was conducted in the Americas by the European, because it was the Europeans who came. Columbus was a European, and the people who landed in Plymouth Rock were European. They were not people coming from Nigeria, West Africa, or India. They were all Europeans who came, and there was a several genocides that happened in the Americas after 1492, in Mexico, in Peru, the native Indian population in America, etc. But 1776 is, in the sense we're talking about, or at least I was talking about,
Hmm.
the 1776 is the American people rose up against an empire. By the way, the Canadian people didn't. They were the same blood. They were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But when the 13 colonies, the people rose up on no taxation without representation, um, that was against the empire. The very principle that uh, people who are not consulted, whose opinions are not taken into account, then they are not citizens, they are slaves, because the rulers are people who are imposing their wishes upon the people. They're extracting the wealth from the people. So it was a revolution against an empire. George III was an emperor. King George III was an emperor of the British Empire. Okay, so that's the point I was driving at, and the Constitution laid down the principle. And the principle that laid down is within the framework of the thinking of the people at a particular time and space, but also looking forward to the possibilities of the future. So there is the Constitution, and what is missing or what can be improved upon can be brought about through the amending formula that is provided for in the Constitution. So there is there. And I always told my students, when discussing American politics, especially in terms of foreign policy, because that's the area that I was involved in the university teaching, that James Madison, who actually drafted the Constitution, who was the fourth president after Jefferson, uh, James Madison, in one of his pieces in the Federalist paper, wrote beautifully. So I'm recalling it from my mind. I'm just paraphrasing it, but the entire paragraph is beautiful. He said, if men were angels, we would not need a government. And if angels were run to a government, then we would not need checks and balances and laws and so on. So men are not angels. We are fallible creatures. And therefore, whether it is a constitution, whether it is a Ten Commandment or religious code of ethics, it is there. And then it is up to the men whether they live up to it. And if they don't live up to it, there are consequences, whatever be the matter of belief system. In the American Constitution, the consequences of the government failing to live up to the principle is that the people in the government can be impeached and removed, so long that the people are awake, and so long the people decide that they're going to act. So yes, 1776, the question of slavery was there, and there was no solution provided for dealing with slavery, because many of the founding fathers were slave owners. You
Hmm.
know that better than me. And so the question is, was the Constitution imperfect in the sense of slavery or of women's right? Yes, but the idea that all men are created equal, that is, men is not here a gender male, men is a universal term. So all men are created equal is a principle that has to be worked out. And it was worked out. Unfortunately, it took a civil war about the women and the right to voting and everything else in terms of equality clause was also had to be worked out, because it was the character of the custom and culture of that time, 18th century, that women were not seen as equal to men. But eventually it was worked out through don't remember the exact amendment. I think it was the 16th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, that the women equality was recognized. Women were given full franchise. So the point is, I'm proposing or dealing with, and again, not as an American, as somebody who's a student of American history and politics, that the Constitution is got the mechanism for remedy. But the Constitution was not made for an empire. So America did become an empire. And particularly in the period after 1945, with, as I was just pointing out, that America emerged in 1945 as a superpower plus. There was no other power in the world anywhere equal to America in terms of military might, in terms of economic engine, in terms of technology. America was the dominant power, the greatest power at that time. Occam's razor, you take a simple variable, the simplest explanation, and then you think about it. America's economic strength was more than 50% of the rest of the world, American GDP. So to have an army, to have the technology, to have all the things that makes for a great power, the economy has to be right. So America was, in that sense, going to dominate. President Roosevelt died before the war ended. President Roosevelt had a different, in my reading of history and in my uh, view and interpretation, President Roosevelt had a different vision. It was not a vision of an empire, it was a vision of sovereign states after the end of colonialism in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. I mean, he was pestering Winston Churchill during the war, because it is during the war that he met Winston Churchill one on one. And as I have read about him and read books written by his son, who was had the privacy to be with his father. I'm talking about Elliot Roosevelt, and observe his father in private conversations and discussion with leaders like Winston Churchill, like Joseph Stalin, like the kings of the Middle East, Egypt, Arabia, and so on, Ethiopia, and other leaders, European leaders. You mentioned de Gaulle. I mean, President Roosevelt was in touch with de Gaulle, met him, spoke with him. So his vision, to put it in a nutshell, was what America is within America, that is a federation. That the 13 colonies that began America, each one of them were equal to one another, whether it was little Connecticut or big Virginia, in terms of their power as spelled out in the Constitution. They were all equal. And as the 10th Amendment says, anything that is not enumerated in the Constitution belongs to the state. So state had rights only in those limited area that was enumerated in the Constitution. as the election of the president, how it was elected, the making of the House, the making of the Senate, the responsibilities of the House and Senate, which each of the states ratified. And then what is not enumerated in the Constitution is outside of federal responsibility. The federation doesn't have any say in the matter. It belongs to the state. So the state has the right as almost independent sovereign player, actor within the federation to do what it wants to do. California can do what it wants to do, and Georgia can do what it wants to do. Nobody can enforce them to do anything against their collective decision. So, what was America? A federation. What did President Roosevelt want? What was his vision that he engaged it from the Atlantic Charter that he signed with Winston Churchill in the summer of 1941, when America was not at war, to the last meeting a month before he died at Yalta in February of 1945, when he met with Stalin. That was a second meeting Stalin, with Churchill, and he himself. It was a vision of a federation, and the federation would be called United Nations. And the United Nations would have a constitution, the charter, and the United Nations would have two assemblies, the General Assembly and the Security Council, and so on. And the Security Council would be the executive, just like the president is the executive. And the General Assembly would be like the Congress, the House representing all the states that become independent and sovereign, representing them who become members of the United Nations. And decisions would be made, in the federation on the basis of the charter, the UN Constitution, and the entire mechanism of international law in terms of treaties, conventions, like the Geneva Convention, like the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, and so on. And then later on, it would be expanded to the negotiations that took place between United States and Soviet Union in terms of arms control, strategic arms limitation talk, anti-ballistic missile treaty, and so on and so forth, INF, etc. Well, Soviet Union does not exist now, but when Soviet Union existed and America negotiated, all of these were recorded within the United Nations. The Non-Proliferation Treaty on the issue of nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. So this would be a federation. So there is an international law, the law of the seas, for instance. And America is bound by all of this because the American Constitution states that for America to be part of any international agreement, that has to be ratified by the Senate under the section 3. I think it is article 3. I think it is section 3 or section 4, the advise and consent clause of the Senate, that it has to be ratified through the advise and consent requirement of a 2/3 majority in the Senate. So the United Nations was voted upon by the Senate, unlike what happened with the League of Nations in 1919, when President Wilson came back from Paris in establishing the League of Nations and submitted the League of Nations charter to the Senate for ratification. The Senate voted it down. And so in the period between 1919 and 1945, America was not a member of the League of Nations. With the 1945 United Nations Foundation, America was the founding member and ratified it. But when Roosevelt died, Truman became the president. And Truman is the man responsible for subverting the United Nations. I don't think too many American people know this or care about it. It is the accident of death in this instance. That famous poem of Robert Frost, that we came upon the road, a fork on the road, and which fork we chose decided our future. President Roosevelt on the fork on the road had the vision of a world managed, administered, run by the guardrails of a federation, a global federation called the United Nations with its constitution. So, America, President Roosevelt did not have the vision of America becoming an empire. It was Truman. Truman was taken over by Churchill, and behind Churchill were all the moneyed oligarchs. Remember, Churchill was the prime minister of the biggest empire at that time, the British Empire. The French Empire had collapsed in the war when Germany defeated France, in 1940. Other empires, that is, we are talking about the European empires, the colonial empires, other empires, the Dutch Empire, the Belgian Empire. The Belgian Empire was one of the biggest empire in Africa,
Hmm.
Congo, and what happened in Congo under the Belgium. So these empires had become weakened, and the question was only time when they would have to leave and give independence to um, to the empires in Africa, Asia, South America that they were dominating and controlling. So the British Empire, Churchill, in the many arguments and discussion between Roosevelt and Churchill during this period, 1941, 45, one of the issues that is fascinating to me, coming from the part of the world that I come from, that I was born in India, one of the questions that Roosevelt kept hammering at Churchill was, when is Britain going to give independence to India? And Churchill's position was, Mr. President, I am not going to be the prime minister of His Majesty to dissolve the empire. That means under him, there will be no end to the empire. But Churchill, after the end of the war, had to go for an election because during the war, 1939, 1945, it was a coalition government. He was the prime minister because the conservative had the majority, but it was a union government, a coalition government during the war, and there was no election during the war. But immediately after the war ended in May 8th, 1945. 2 days later, Churchill had to call an election because the government would have collapsed with a no confidence vote in the parliament. So uh, the election was called, and 3 weeks later, Churchill was out of office. He lost the election. The man who claims to have won the war, with his famous finger, lost the election. He was no longer prime minister. And the man who became the prime minister, Clement Attlee, the first thing that he did was to announce that Britain is going to leave India and give India independence within 2 years. That was the end of the British Empire, because with India gone, which happened, all the rest would follow. But here's the point. During the time of the transition in England, with the election happening, Churchill was meeting President Truman at the Potsdam Conference after the war, the first conference where Stalin came, Churchill came, and Truman went. Roosevelt was dead. And it is in that conference, in that private meetings, that Churchill got into the head of Truman and told him, this is the time. If we don't take over the world, then the Soviet Union will take it over, beginning in Europe and then the rest. It was not a question anymore that Soviet Union was an ally. I don't think too many Americans even think about this. Now Russia is an enemy. Well, Russia was the ally that Roosevelt, with all of his energy, as he was a failing man, as he was an ill man on a wheelchair, traveling to Cairo, traveling to Tehran, traveling to Yalta to meet with Stalin to discuss these issues, he knew that without the Soviet Union, Germany would not be defeated. And that is what happened. America lost around about 420,000 men in the Second World War, and Soviet Union lost near 30 million men,
Mm-hmm.
right? How many Americans remember that? It was the Soviet manpower that defeated the German army. Almost 80% of German army was in the Eastern Front, not in the Western Front. So Soviet Union was an ally. And the agreement, the understanding that was reached between Roosevelt and Stalin was that these two countries will cooperate despite their differences in systems. America as a democracy, Soviet Union as a communist power. In international politics, they're allies. They're not looking inside the countries, because the United Nations Charter does not have any position of what happens inside a country that is sovereign. It's like me having an opinion of how Rashid Muhammad is going to run his house. That's not my business. Neither it is your business to come and tell me how should I run my house. You can have your woke, you can have your transgender, but you can't go to Ghana and tell them to have woke and transgender. You know, so this is the UN Charter. This is the UN Constitution. It was a balance of power. It was an agreement. That agreement was blown away. The dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not simply to end the war in Japan. The war had ended. It was only a matter of time. All the leading generals of the American army, General George Marshall, General Eisenhower, General MacArthur, all had told Truman, the war is over. It's just a matter of time. Because Truman wanted to know their opinion on the use of a bomb once the bomb had been tested, in Los Alamos. And the generals told him privately, and these are all in record, that the war is over in a matter of time. So the bomb was still dropped. And Truman claimed it was to to end the war and to save American lives in invading Japan. But that was totally unnecessary, because Stalin had promised to Roosevelt that as soon as the war in Europe ends, he will turn the army and send it to the East, to confront Japan. And in Potsdam, that's exactly what Stalin told him. But Truman did not tell Stalin that he has the bomb and he's going to use it, which is what Churchill wanted him to do. And so the bomb was dropped as a message, as a signal to Stalin that we have the bomb, you better be careful, and to become an empire. That means the whole United Nations thing, as Roosevelt had thought about, was abandoned by Truman. And that is the beginning. The whole containment policy, the whole idea the Soviet Union is our enemy and to surround the world. That's why Vietnam War was fought. That's why Korean War was fought. But these wars never ended because they wanted to keep the fuse going, because war is the mechanism of silencing the people domestically. You question the war, you are a traitor. Remember, in that period, who lost China was taking place, as if it was America's to lose China or to own China. That, 500, 600 million people is supposed to be America's possession. Such utter nonsense, but that was what it was. There was a whole crisis in America, the Red Scare in America, which was also directed at the Soviet Union. In fact, Soviet Union was the main target, because China was seen as a puppet of Soviet Union. Mao Zedong was seen as a puppet of Stalin, and so to contain communism, to stop. That's why again the Korean War took place, and then the Vietnam War. So the issue of fighting communism was a pretext for a continuing perpetual war for perpetual peace. That's exactly what Eisenhower won. He's the general. He won the war. He knows what is happening. If you, brother, read the speeches, if American people read the speech, the farewell address of Eisenhower, he lays it down. How much one fighter jet cost, and if that money would be sent for building schoolhouses, would be sent for making hospitals, would be sent for improving the lives of the people. So, yes, it it was America that started moving toward becoming an empire. And in 1945, with Truman as president, it was very easy because Truman had no understanding of the world. Truman did not go around the world. Truman was a politician from Midwest America, Missouri, which was a border state during the Civil War. The whole issue of black and white was there, you know, in Truman's life and Truman's growing up. And so Churchill and the Zionist organization that now controls the president and the Congress came into effect. And against the advice of a senior most cabinet secretary, starting with George Marshall. George Marshall, in fact, told Truman that if the president goes along to recognize Israel, then he would be forced to vote against the president in the upcoming election. Direct statement made to Truman privately. All right. So all of these people, his assistant or deputy secretary in the State Department, Lloyd Henderson, who was in charge for the Near Eastern affair, was absolutely clear. His defense secretary, who died under mysterious circumstances,
Mhm,
James Forrestal,
mhm,
and many through circumstantial evidence believe that he was pushed to his death. It was not a suicide. He was pushed to his death in the hospital that he was in, recuperating from some illness. All of these people advised Truman against it. And yet there were those who came for political reason, put money in Truman's hand, you know, funded his campaign, and the rest is history.
mhm,
The creation, establishment of a Jewish state, when the last man that President Roosevelt met on his way back from Yalta was King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. And in that meeting, the discussion between the president and the king was about Palestine. The king wanted to know what would be the Arab opinion, what's his opinion. And the king said to the president, "We have had no negative relationship with the Jews. They have lived with us. They can come and live with us. But to talk about creating a state, you know, by taking away land and removing the people from that land is not something that we can accept. Because in our view and in our belief, the person who have harmed the victim must pay the compensation. So you can create a state in Europe for the Jews because they are European."
mhm,
And the president is supposed to have said, these are all again documented because the conversation was taking place between the king and the president on the president's ship that was taking president back from Yalta, USS Quincy. And so there were translators, there were interpreters around both men. And so this is all on record. The president said to his senior officials, once the king left, that he learned from the king in 10 minutes much more than all that his advisors told him for the past 3, 4 years on the subject.
Mhm.
We don't know if Roosevelt had been alive, what would have been his decision on this matter,
Mhm.
because he had seen, he had heard. He spoke to King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He spoke to the Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian king. He spoke to King Farouk, or King Fuad, the Egyptian king, and all of them told him the same thing. So the death of Roosevelt, the taking over of Truman, and Truman becoming, a puppet in the hands of Churchill, who was a Zionist, and then the Zionists coming in and helping President Truman during the 1948 election, which, according to all the polling, he was supposed to lose it to the Republican nominee and governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. In fact, there is that famous Chicago Daily paper
Mhm.
have seen that Truman is holding on the night of election, saying, Dewey defeats Truman, and Truman
Mhm.
is laughing. Well, the president train that ran from Washington all across the Midwest, to the mountain states, uh, for Truman's campaign, 1948 campaign, it was paid by the Zionists.
Mhm.
Truman didn't have the money.
Mhm.
The
And let
campaign
us
had the money.
not forget that there was a fascist coup attempt against Roosevelt too, with Smedley Butler and all of them talked about it. So all of that took place. A lot of people don't even know about that
Well,
fascist coup.
his death remains with an asterisk, because there is the story. It's not a story. I mean, it is a documented thing that Stalin gave Elliot Roosevelt the permission to come to Moscow soon after the death of his father, President Roosevelt, because Elliot wanted to talk to Stalin. Possibly you have read about this, and Stalin told Elliot that your father was murdered.
Mhm.
And Elliot said, "How do you know? What makes you think so? And who would have murdered him?" And Stalin said, "The Churchill gang." So Stalin said, "I sent my man, who was the ambassador, Soviet ambassador in Washington." He said, "I sent my man Gromyko, Andrei Gromyko, um, to Hot Springs, where President Roosevelt died. That was his presidential retreat in Georgia. And I think it was called Hot Spring or Warm Spring." And he said, I sent him to pay respect to the president from me, and to make a special effort to see the president, his body. And Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, refused permission to Gromyko to see the body. And Joseph Stalin said to Elliot, they refused to let my man see President Roosevelt, because he would have known, he would have seen the evidence that he was possibly murdered. Because I understand President Roosevelt did not have an autopsy done. An autopsy was not done upon him. His body was put in the casket and placed in the casket, closed, and then sent back to Washington, on a special train for his to take him to Hyde Park, New York, for his funeral. So it's a mystery. The president died. He could have died of natural causes, or he could have been poisoned.
mm,
Given the fact that there have been assassination and murder of presidents in American history, it is not beyond possibility that Roosevelt was also a victim of his politics, because of what he was looking towards in terms of international politics. And we know that the Zionists are pretty well equipped to murder people, you know,
mhm,
who stand in their way.
mhm,
Issue of Kennedy hangs, which has not 60 plus years later, the files have not been opened. So
mhm,
yes, America becomes an empire, and becoming an empire ultimately means the abandonment of the Constitution. But we come now on the 80th year of America after the war, 2025, 2026. The American is now in a state of anemia. The economy, which was more than 50% of the world economy, is now less than 25% of the world economy. And when you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, PPP, the American economy has been exceeded by the Chinese economy.
mhm,
China is now the number one economy in the world, according to PPP. And it is very interesting ranking now. The five global economy, the top five global economy on the PPP calculation, which is the purchasing power calculation. Number one economy is China. Number two economy is United States. Number three is India. Number four is
right.
Japan.
And then
And number
Russia.
five is Russia. So, of the five ranking economies, only one is a European economy. That is America. America as
Mhm,
part of that European structure, culture, civilization. All the four are Asian economies. I mean, Russia is a Eurasian country, China is an Asian country, Japan and India. So, what has happened, I would say, if I might take a couple of minutes here to expand upon this, in
yes,
80 years,
sir.
the ranking has changed, the economic situations have changed. America is no longer the dominant power except for its military, its nuclear might. But that too has been countered by the Russians and the Chinese. Um, the war in Ukraine was, in a sense, I would make the argument, was the attempt by the European American alliance, European Union, NATO, America alliance, to dismantle Russia. It began under Obama. It began even before. It began under George W. Bush, the color revolution, the first one in 2005 in Ukraine, and then followed by one in Georgia. Both of them did not go as far as what happened in 2014, when the elected president of Ukraine was, by a coup, the Maidan coup, was removed from power. And then, the acceleration of attacking Russian people, Russian speaking people, and uh, Orthodox Christians in the eastern side of Ukraine, that led to the military action in 2022. And it was all designed to lure Russia into a conflict, but which would then allow, the pretext would allow to arm fully Ukraine and use Ukraine to basically dismantle the regime in Moscow. That is, regime change in Moscow, and in the process, to dismantle Russia, to take over the Russian economy. So, yeah, you got that picture over there. China is now the world's largest economy. We shouldn't be shocked. Yeah. Um,
It, I put that up there. Let's see. Let me go back to 2020. That was
Yes,
October
October 2020.
15, 2020, and it says this is from the national become the largest economy in the world, measured by the more refined yardstick that both the IMF and CIA now judge to be the single best metric for comparing national economies. The IMF report shows that China's economy is one-sixth larger than America's, and that is the main thing that I believe that is driving the policies of America, because she's no longer the top dog. And as you were saying, and I hated to interrupt you, but as you were saying that only one Western nation is in that category. And if you look at the way that America fudges the book, you cannot even be sure that America is number two when it comes to the purchasing power parity, because America is now a service economy, which she doesn't produce multiple things. And I believe to keep her dollar in the position as a global currency, I believe this is why she's going rogue globally. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was driving at, that the war in Ukraine
Mhm.
backfired. You were talking about blowback or backfired. You know, in effect, the combined forces of the European Union, of NATO, that is America led, failed to achieve its objective. The objective was the dismantling of the Russian leadership and the Russian economy, and to parcel it. So, what is this empire trying to do? In the simplest term, Occam's razor again, the simplest explanation is that the empire needs resources, natural resources, as a collateral
Mhm.
for a sinking economy.
Mhm.
See, you were talking about 1971. What happened in 1971? Nixon was forced to go off the gold standard. In 1971, uh, $35 bought you an ounce of gold. That was the currency, the gold standard. So internationally, $35 to an ounce of gold. The dollar was pegged to gold. But the Vietnam War was, in a sense, the nail in the coffin of the gold standard for America, because the war was being fought without providing for its expenditure, war expenditure, through taxation. You know, in other words, the military-industrial complex was fighting the war uh, by trying to fool the American people that you don't have to worry about this war. There is no cost to this war. You know, but war is an expensive proposition, and so there was a drain on American economy, uh, war economy, but without the support domestically for it. And the people around the countries around the world, the dominant power, you mentioned de Gaulle, the same thing with Britain, they wanted to pull out of the dollar by getting their gold, exchange the dollar for the gold. And so Nixon went off the gold standard. Uh, and then the next step was going off the gold standard. What would be the collateral behind the dollar? So, following the 1973 Arab Israeli War, in which there was the oil price quadrupling, if you remember, brother. I was in America at that time. I was in San Francisco, a young 21-year-old guy, just recently arrived, and I saw the lineups. I saw the panic, in '74 when I was in San Francisco, and the anger of the people, and so on and so forth. The lineups. Um, well, there was a negotiation that took place between the Americans and the Saudi government, representing the Arab oil producing states, which was part of OPEC. At that time, the Shah of Iran was in power in Iran, and it was a major oil. It is a major oil producing country, but the Shah was an ally of the United States. There was this negotiation, and the negotiation was one thing is that Kissinger and company from before the war, before 71, wanted the price of oil to be increased. They were demanding there secretly. We now know of it because we have seen the documentation and the argumentation. So when the oil price quadrupling took place as a result of the war, it was not an unexpected thing for the American leadership. Why they wanted increase in the price of oil? Because they wanted oil as a commodity to not be used up. They wanted its life to be extended, and a higher price would be the incentive for more exploration of oil around the world. At $2 a barrel, oil was at that time was not an attractive proposition for doing more exploration. As the price goes up, then the possibility of exploration. And one of the significant development was the development exploration in the North Sea when the North Sea oil was discovered. In Canada, it was the tar sand oil that was discovered in Alberta and in northern Canada. So there was the oil economy and oil politics that was behind closed door. People were discussing, but the Arab-Israeli war brought the agenda very quickly forward. So the oil issue, the Vietnam issue, going off the gold standard, these were all converging. And the resolution of this was that the oil producers, particularly Saudi Arabia and at that time Iran, they agreed to the proposition made by Kissinger and company that they will sell oil only on the basis of US dollar, and the oil price will be measured on US dollar. So that's the coming of the term petrodollar. So all the countries in the world, energy is the number one demand for every country, every people. Uh, they have to buy oil if they don't produce oil. I mean, country like India, massive, huge country, but hasn't got oil. But all these countries around the world would have to buy oil by having dollars. So how do you get dollar? You change your currency for American dollars. So you start buying American dollars. So that became the way oil became the collateral for the US dollar. And so from 1974 to 2024, 50 years, the oil has been the petrodollar has been the national the global currency, which is American dollar, and the American dollar being the global currency, the demand for American dollar has been always there. And small countries, big countries, rich countries, powerful countries have had to buy American dollar, that is, buy US Treasury bills to have the resource and the currency to buy oil. And so, in effect, America could carry on deficit financing by printing dollars without having the collateral of its own. That is, the collateral is the OPEC oil being sold in US dollars, and whatever is American oil that is exported, that's not too much of it, would also be in US dollars. Now, that issue has come to a point where it is no longer guaranteed. It's only a matter of time because America has overreached. If America was engaged in diplomacy, in respecting others and carrying on instead of doing what America has been doing, making war, coercing, threatening, bullying people, that you have to get dollar, you have to invest in American Treasury bill, and so on and so forth, there will be obviously a reluctance. And a search for an alternative. Now, ironically, you talk about Bill Clinton and his policy. It began with basically with George Bush. Remember when that is the father, George Herbert Walker Bush, when in his re-election in 1992, he was challenged by Ross Perot, the third party. And the whole argument of Ross Perot was against George Herbert Walker Bush that his administration had opened up this policy of moving manufacturing out of America to the low wage countries, principal one being China. But then there were other low wage countries too, India, Indonesia, and so on, that is in the Pacific region. That was the beginning. Ross Perot said, you're doing this, you're swooping this, and this is the rushing out of American jobs, American money, and so on and so forth. Ross Perot lost. George Bush lost. Clinton came in with less than 50% of the vote. The first president to win the election with under 50% of the popular vote. But his policy not only carried on George Bush's policy, he accelerated it. And so the offshoring of American manufacturing from mainland America to China started accelerating. 30 years later, America has very little manufacturing in terms of its supply chain and major industries like steel in America. It's all been offshored to China. And that period from early 1990s to where we are 35 years later has brought about this massive transition that has taken place in manufacturing. China is now the leading manufacturing country. And America, the whole argument of Donald Trump has been to bring back jobs. But that cannot be done in a 2-year election cycle. It moves along just like the Chinese. It took 30, 35 years for them to make the transition. And so Donald Trump's policy in his second return to the White House has been to threaten everybody. And that is the policy of tariff. And the policy of tariff has backfired. He said that, countries will come to kiss my ass to be taken, but the countries have refused. They have gone to pick up the falling trade with America to doing trade among themselves outside the dollar range. So they don't have to buy dollar anymore to do trade, particularly in energy. And then they don't have to depend upon the American market. They have been switching over, especially the Chinese, they've been switching over to market outside of America. And so this is the transition that is taking place. So in a larger sense, in a short-term sense that we were talking about, was the period of the Trump government administration, Obama administration, Biden administration, looking at this election cycle where long-term planning is more or less missing, except the long-term planning of wars. Continuing war is the only. That's all that America now sells to the rest of the world, the F-35, the F-16, and what have you, But from pharmaceutical to computer chips are being manufactured outside of America, and with the rare earth material, that is going to become even tougher. I mean, Trump has now brought about this situation that the Chinese have closed down the export of rare earth materials because they control almost 90% of it. But in the long term, in the big picture, what Donald Trump and the Americans have done, they have trashed their own constitution. That means a constitution that was built upon the idea that what John Quincy Adams had spoken about as one of the founding fathers and the son of a president when he became the president. he had spoken about, that America does not go looking for monsters. And this is not America's business. Monroe Doctrine is not to make America an imperial power. Monroe Doctrine was to keep the imperial powers outside of America, outside of South America, so that, you know, there would be independence coming, revolution coming in America, just as George Washington had brought about revolution in the 13th colony. There would be Simon Bolivars and others who would do the same thing with the same ambition and similar desires for the people in rest of America, whether it is Mexico, Central America, Brazil, Argentina, and so on and so forth. But after 1898, the Spanish American War, the whole concept of Monroe Doctrine was put on its head, that America will be the imperial power over these countries, and that was not what was the original meaning of James Monroe's doctrine. So anyhow, America has become an empire, but an empire that goes, through its own life cycle and ends up, in a state of the late stage empire, when it becomes desperate to maintain its hegemony without the inner capacity anymore, alive, strong, motivated to be able to sustain it. And that's the stage where America has arrived. And so all the noise that you're hearing, we are hearing, is the noise of a desperate late stage empire trying to extend its life when others are pulling away.
Mm-hmm.
And the only question that the American people are faced with, are they going to rise up and take back the republic, or are they going to allow their empire to crash and all of them, like being on a Titanic, go down with the empire?
So, what do you think is coming with the Iran before we? Because you've given me an hour and a half of your time, and I know you're busy. So, before we close out, give me your perspective on this push for war with Iran, and will Iran respond and respond like never before if they are hit?
Well, in a nutshell, Iran will respond. Uh, in the danger that I see for all of us is how real is not Iran, but how real is Israel with a Samson option? Is this simply a rhetorical matter, or is it really real that they will pull the Samson option? Because a war, if it breaks out, and it seems more and more likely that it will break out, given Trump's state of mind, uh, that um, Iran will respond. Iran will be bombed this time if Trump goes in, unlike the 12-day war in June, which was more of a kabuki theater. Because remember, at the end of the 12-day war, Trump said, we have obliterated Iran's nuclear power. We have obliterated, he used the word, there is nothing left. So if that is the case, why is he now saying that this is all about nuclear weapons? You
Mhm.
obliterated it 6 months ago. In 6 months, Iran has got these nuclear weapons. So that's upset that the first either the possibility, the first one, the June war, was a kabuki theater. It was all staged to sort of take away the pressure from Trump that Netanyahu and the Zionists were putting upon him. That is, the donors in America, the AIPAC, the Miriam Adelson, and the whole lot of them putting pressure on Trump for the money that they had paid him to take out Iran. So he said, okay. And uh, Israel did the decapitation strike and caught Iran off guard, because the Iranians were engaged in diplomatic negotiation in Oman at the time, June 13. Their people were in Oman talking to the Americans about bringing all of these matters to some sort of a conclusion, because it was Mr. Trump who tore up the deal that the American government under Obama and the other members of the Security Council, plus Germany, that is the P5+1, had signed with Iran, called JCPO, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that Iran agreed to, which would allow IAEA, the International Agency for Energy, etc., International Atomic Energy Association, to monitor the enrichment program of Iran, to keep it under, I think, 60% uh, uranium refinement, for purely for domestic medical purposes and energy purposes. Uh, and Iran signed that. Iran is also a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel is not. And
Right.
Israel is a nuclear weapon state, though it does not make any admission about it. That was the issue that led to the problems with President John F. Kennedy. Um, so here we are in 2025, and Israel strikes Iran while Iran is negotiating with America. And then Israel is desperately runs 10 days after to ask Trump to bring about a ceasefire, but to take out the nuclear sites in those two places. For thou, I don't directly remember all the names right now. And
Isfahan.
Isfahan, for thou, and there was another Natanz.
Mhm.
Natanz, Isfahan, and for thou. Um, and Trump sent in his B-2 bombers and cruise missiles to close up and bring about a ceasefire, because um, Iran had, with pinpoint accuracy, struck at very sensitive, uh, you know, um, sites in Israel. Um, but Israel has been insisting for a second round, and so it seems that Trump is caught between the hammer and the anvil. Domestically he has no support, or the support is very little, and his own narcissistic megalomania is at stake, because did if Trump doesn't go forward, Trump has chicken out once again. That is the whole issue. But the Israelis are insistent on this matter. So if there is a breakout anytime in the next week or so, uh, this time Iran has made it very clear that it is going to go all out, and that it will take on Israel. It will knock off all of the sites where America have installation in the Gulf. For instance, in Qatar, in United Arab Emirates, even Saudi Arabia. And Israel will be, in that sense, completely targeted. All of its major installations will be targeted. Possibly Dimona will be targeted. And we will see. But Iran will be hurt. But here is another conversation. I mean, yeah, as you pointed out, we have gone pretty long. But let me drop the idea, and if you want, we can come back whenever you wish to.
Mhm.
um, People in America and people in the West, particularly, generally, have very little idea of other people. They never had any idea of Vietnamese. Vietnamese, fought, people living in bamboo houses fought for 20 years for their sovereignty and for their independence. They didn't give up. Um, the case of Iran is to understand what Iran represents. In my view, Iran represents the bleeding heart of Islam. Iran is a Shia society, Shiism. I am a Sunni Muslim, but I am empathetic to understanding in this division between Shiaism and Sunniism in Islam. Shiism is the minority uh, group, sect in Islam. There is about roughly somewhere around 18% of the world Muslim population are Shia, and Iran has the largest component of that. It is the majority Shia country. And as I phrased it, it is the bleeding heart of Islam. It is the faith, the sect that takes the issue of martyrdom at its highest, you know. Um, and so the commitment and the devotion to the principles that Shiaism adhere to, the example Shiaism adhere to, that is the fourth caliph of Islam, but the first imam of Shiism is Ali.
Ali,
And Ali was
the prophet's
the cousin of the Prophet and
mhm.
also the son in law of the Prophet. And the devotion of the Shia to Ali and Ali's son, who was the grandson of the Prophet, from his daughter Fatima, that is Hussein, Imam Hussein, who's the third caliph, a third imam of Shiism. Both of them were martyred. That martyrdom represents what I said, the bleeding heart of Islam, the devotion to the Prophet's family, to the two, uh, Ali and Hussein, and all of that which surrounds this identity of Iran is at stake. Now, whether the rest of the Muslim world stands behind Iran is a matter of discussion because of Saudi Arabia, because of the other Arab states. But anyone who is devoted to Islam as a Muslim, regardless of whether they're Sunni or Shia, they understand what Shiism means. And so I would say that to doubt the words of Ayatollah Khamenei or the leadership of Iran would be a lethal mistake, a fatal mistake. They will accept their martyrdom, but they're not going to give up the principle for which they stand.
Mhm. Once again, you hit it out of the park. We have to get you back here. Shukram. Thank you for everything. Um, and I'll send you the video in a few minutes. Be safe and be blessed.
Thank you. Thank you. Salam. Peace to you,
Walaikum.
brother.
Yes, walaikum salam. And ma salama. Everybody, um, I want to just say this before we go off there. I always say this: please do right by others, not because there's some material gain to be had by it or some accolades, but do right by others because it's the right, the humane, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember that God Almighty is watching you. As my late, great, and beautiful mother would always say, God sits high on the throne of power, but he looks low at the actions of man. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that the true and living God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, remember to stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy still loves you more than life. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. We're out of here. Peace.
Thank you.